This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Alexandra Steed, a passionate landscape architect with a profound commitment to art, sustainability, and the transformative power of landscapes. Alexandra recently authored Portrait to Landscape, and in this interview, we talk about the possibility of, and the necessity for, shaping our landscapes so they may help to heal the earth.
So my name's Alexandra Steed. I'm a landscape architect and an urban designer. And I grew up in Vancouver, which is a beautiful place, spectacular by nature. And so I really grew up with an absolute love of nature. And that was also supported by my parents' love of gardening and love of beauty all around us. So I'd say my start as a landscape architect started very early, but I actually went into art. That was my first degree. And I realized there that I wanted to be working with the medium of the landscape itself. So, the ability to sculpt the earth and to work with plants and changing materials that are so wonderful. I realized that that's what I wanted to do. So I went into landscape architecture. And I've now been working in the field for about 25 years. I did my first few years in Vancouver and have spent the last 20 years working in London across a wide range of geographies and a wide range of types of projects. So I've been very privileged to have a wonderful career, I would say, and something that I always find delightful and completely wondrous. So, yes.
So you've written a book which is called Portrait to Landscape. And I was reading it and I thought, I wonder who this book is written for. And it's because, for me, it all seemed very straightforward. But obviously, you are very experienced. You've been working a long time in your field. Do you think this message is not necessarily filtering through? And also, is that a country to country thing? Does it vary?
Yeah, great question. Well, yes, when I went about writing the book, what I really wanted to do was to disseminate this idea about the power of landscape and to disseminate it much further than within the field of landscape architecture or horticulture or ecology, but to the much wider population and people that possibly don't often think about landscape as such. Because I really do believe that there's so much, as you said, sort of common sense, practical knowledge held within the processes of landscape and working with the land, working with soil and water and air. It's the very foundation of life. And so it all makes complete sense. And yet I think in our era, we've become so disconnected from the land that it doesn't come naturally to most of us. And I'd say that probably happening worldwide, more in certain places than others. Certainly in urbanized environments, I think that we are much more disconnected from the land than possibly indigenous communities who are fully integrated in their landscapes. But I'd say the majority of the world's population are living in places now that have some sort of disconnection from the land. And so it was really my hope that I could reach a very wide audience for them to feel the hope and the potential that is held within recovering landscapes. So that's really what I was hoping to do, to reach a wide audience and not just people that are currently working within the field.
So obviously the title is Portrait to Landscape, and I think it's fair to say that that's the kind of jumping off point for your ideas that are carried within the book. Can you explain the idea behind that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd been thinking about writing this book for a few years, and I forget sort of where it happened along the process, but one day I just realized, it's like the world is kind of held within this adolescent state where humans are constantly focusing on themselves, like the story of Narcissus, where he's always just focusing on himself, staring at his reflection in a pond. And that ends up being his demise because, he stops eating, stops caring for himself. And so eventually this focus on himself leads to his own demise. And I see that in our world very clearly portrayed in how there's this sort of addiction to taking selfies now, so that the camera's focused on ourselves. And oftentimes we're not even really looking around at the world around us. And we're often forgetting the wonder of that world. So for me, that idea of changing from a portrait view of just looking at ourselves and solely focusing on humans and looking outwards towards a broader and expansive landscape community and sort of seeing ourselves within that much wider frame. For me, that expression portrait to landscape sort of helped to encapsulate that transformation and shift in paradigm that we need to have, that's moving away from just solely thinking about ourselves and humans' wants and desires to what is really required for the whole living community to make sure that our world, our planet, the earth, is able to sort of thrive in perpetuity.
What you said there about forgetting the wonder takes me on so beautifully to my next question, which was, as I was reading the book, you mentioned the biosphere, and I just actually took a moment and sat back and thought, that is incredible. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. And perhaps you could just enlighten us if people don't know what the biosphere is, you could tell us, or maybe remind us if we've forgotten just how magical it is.
Yeah, well, I think even in the book, I included a chapter about the biosphere, almost like a pause just to consider the wonder of it, as you said, because it is miraculous. I mean, the biosphere is a relatively thin skin of life that envelops the globe. And it's the location of all life on the earth, in the air, on the ground, in the water. And, it's the only location of life that we know of anywhere, within our solar system or the galaxy or possibly even within the universe. We don't know. So it's this miraculous place. And it's only about 20 kilometers deep. And, when you consider the diameter of the Earth is more than 12,000 kilometers. So when you think that this is only 20 kilometers, it's a really thin sort of skin around the globe. And so it is fragile, it is vulnerable. And, I kind of like to think about it like the human body, where the biosphere is one living system, even though it includes all of life, but it is one living system the way our body is. And so it's kind of this unique tapestry of landscapes that all come together and each playing a vital role that helps to keep sort of a harmonious balance and equilibrium among all things. So, just like the way our human body can become destabilized if one part is attacked by a virus or weakened by disease, it then destabilizes the whole system. And that's the same with the biosphere, so we need to be thinking about the contaminants we're pumping in to the water or to our soils, or the pollution that's being emitted into the air, all the natural resources that are being extracted and destroyed. All of these things, we might think of them happening in isolation, but it's never isolated. It always has an effect on the greater whole. So yeah, it's a wonderful thing. And oftentimes astronauts have commented on this kind of wonder that they experience when they go into space and they see the Earth, sort of hanging within the blackness of space on its own. And they often talk about how they then understand the connectedness of us all, of all living beings, and not just all of humanity, but connecting with the wider living Earth. And they recognize the awesomeness and the fragility and the preciousness of it when they see it in that context. I think they call it the overview effect. So I think that's something probably that we all need to experience a little bit more often so that we would remember and appreciate just how awesome this Earth is.
Is it possible for you to drill down your ideas into almost an elevator pitch? Because it is such a huge, huge subject and it encompasses so many things that are interconnected. could you sum up your feelings about how we're treating the landscape and how we can best move forwards with that?
Well, it is a great question. I guess it is something that I thought about quite a lot while I was writing the book, really trying to pull together all of these ideas that seem so disparate into something that makes a little bit more sense. And so I guess in response to that, what I would say is that our world is facing these immense environmental threats, climate change, ecological collapse, rapid population expansion, terrible pollution, all of these things, these extraordinary challenges have all been brought about by human action and activity. And they're all based on this paradigm of human dominance and separation from the rest of nature. So one way that I can see to kind of encapsulate our problem is that we have a broken relationship with nature. And this is really evident in the world's landscapes. This is where the brokenness is most real and most evident. But it's also the very place where healing can come about. And so that's what I find so exciting, is that within the world's landscapes, regeneration can occur if we heal our fractured relationship with nature. And we can do this practically by embracing the land, remembering our connection with the soils, the water, and the air, and supporting its protection, restoration, and stewardship at a grand scale. So I would say, in terms of our relationship with landscapes, this has to be achieved within urban environments, within rural environments, and within our wilderness, because it's across all of the world's landscapes as essential elements of the biosphere, which we were just talking about, that the whole needs to be restored and protected and regenerated for future generations.
So you mentioned urban and rural landscapes there. Are the two ways of managing those different environments very different, or are they interconnected?
Well, I think the way they're currently approached is very differently. In my experience, working in urban environments, landscapes are typically treated as, well, they're very hard, for one, but they're also treated mostly in terms of getting people outside and providing public space for people, which is incredibly important in urban environments. But I would say that our approach to integrating nature into urban environments is lagging way behind. And it's something that could be done. We can practically restore a lot of urban habitats if we are looking at things like soil, water, and air. The same way we could be looking at those three elements in rural landscapes. So I think, yes, the outcome and the application and the scale of things between urban and rural landscapes is different, and possibly the way they appear. But our thinking behind it, thinking about how can we create healthy soils? How can we create a healthy hydrological system here? How can we help to purify the air? These are all questions that we can ask across all of these landscapes, and that should be driving our approach, but currently aren't. so that, there's a huge amount we could be doing there to improve our approach to both urban and rural landscapes.
A lot of what you go into in the book seems to be kind of quite high level change that needs to happen. And I do wonder, being cynical and, believing that a lot of things are just driven by an interest for money, ultimately.
Yeah.
As a population, can we rely on change that comes from the top down?
No. That is a resounding no. We cannot rely on top-down change only. I think we should be pushing for top-down change. And I think we should be using our voice as citizens to encourage the existing politicians to be doing things that we know are right for the environment. We can be involved in rallies and marches and protests. We can be writing letters. We can be voting for politicians that actually care and are willing to do something. But I'm also very cynical and know that we really need a ground up approach to make this happen. And it's a change that needs to happen within each one of us as individuals. I think that's probably the bottom line is each one of us needs to change our thinking and to understand our interdependence with all of nature. Once we've really wrapped our head around that concept that we are just one of many, many important life forms, and that we are completely dependent on the health of our soils, our waters, all of the plants and the amazing habitats and ecosystems. We're completely dependent on these things for our food, for our water, for our air. We can't survive without them. And so I think we just need to really remember this, and that will help to drive all of the decisions that we make around the way we want to educate our children, the kind of work that we want to be involved in, the kind of hobbies and activities that we want to be involved in amongst our community. All of these things that will really start to be integrated then into every part of our lives, like even the food that we eat, where we buy our food, the kind of farmers that we choose to buy from. All of these things will then become much more obvious and integrated into the very fabric of our own lives. And that's where change really needs to happen. But it also needs to happen from the top down.
And what do you think the chances are of that change happening as things stand at the moment from the top down?
Well, I think one has to remain hopeful. So though I am also quite cynical and sometimes incredibly frustrated and disappointed and sad and angry about the things that are going on in this world and the promises that are made by politicians that are then broken, I do remain hopeful because I feel that without hope, we have nothing. And that hope is what keeps driving me forward to do what I can to bring about change. So yes, I suppose, knowing all of that, knowing all of the horrible things that are going on, I still try to focus on the good. And oftentimes the good things are happening and we just don't even know about it. But the more you research, the more you find out and look within the community, then you realize actually there are loads of grassroots initiatives that are going on that we often just don't even hear about or are not aware of. But then when we start looking for them, then we see, oh, wow, there's loads of people that are already kind of involved in this movement and doing what they can and that we can align ourselves with. So I think there's so much good going on that I really try and cling to that while being realistic and while sort of being practical about my approach.
Yeah, and I think writing a book is a massive thing that would, change minds. And the way you've laid it out with all the facts, I don't think anyone could read it and think, wow, there isn't scope for change, there isn't a need for change, and, that we kind of all need to be active on that front. Taking it to a personal level for you and your practice, how do you cope if you maybe come up against something that you don't believe in or that compromises, your ways of working or your beliefs? How do you deal with that in a work situation?
It's a tough one because I feel that as designers and practitioners, we can never do exactly what we would love to do or what we believe is the right thing. We're always bound by working for clients, whether they be local authorities or developers or, corporations, that sort of thing. But what we do try and do is be very careful in the early stages. So even when we're considering working on a particular project, to find out as much as we can about what the client's approach is and if that aligns with our value system and if we will be able to achieve on a particular project, at least broadly, what we would hope to be achieving, even if in each and every detail we can't do so. So yeah, we're very careful about the projects that we take on. We often will decline projects. That's not unusual at all for us. And I think also because we have a certain reputation of doing quite regenerative and ecologically responsible and socially responsible work, that attracts certain clients to us as well. So if we have a client, for instance, that really isn't interested in improving the natural environment, they typically wouldn't come to us anyway, because they'd know that that just wouldn't jive with us.
So I was thinking about if there was a good project that you might direct people to say, it could be one of yours, it could be another project. Where would you direct people to say, this is an example of something that's been done really well, and I can fully support the initiative?
One thing that comes to mind really quickly is a project called the Sponge Cities. Now, this is happening in China. This is where this idea originally came about. Oh, I can't remember his name now. Wonderful landscape architect, actually, who is working in China and looking at how so many of the cities within China, how they will be dealing with flooding that's already happening, but that will just keep worsening along with climate change. So he's put in place this concept of sponge cities that the Chinese government has now adopted, and they're integrating it into 30 cities across China. This sponge city approach, which is basically using wetlands and restoring wetlands within urban areas to act as sponges that can absorb a lot of this excess water, can help to filter pollutants out of that water, can help to restore ecosystems, improve natural habitats, improve the groundwater situation. There's, huge benefits. And so they're creating these big wetland parks within their urban environments to do all of these wonderful things. So I think that is a really exciting project to look up. And there's lots of great installations of that now. Not all 30 projects have been completed, but many of them have. So if you look up sponge cities online, you'll find that. You'll find some great examples of what's happening there. Maybe I'll just mention one that we've been working on that your audience might enjoy, and that is for South Essex. So we've been working in the Thames Estuary with the Association of South Essex Local Authorities to come up with a landscape framework for the whole region. So 6 local authorities plus Essex County Council came together there in recognition that they needed to collaborate to really tackle the challenges that that region is experiencing to do with, a huge amount of expected growth, looking at how to deal with all of the industry and the pollution, looking at a lack of connectivity to the city. So there's loads of things. There's a lot of deprived communities there, a lot of communities that don't have access to nature areas or to the waterfront, even though they're within the Thames Estuary. So they brought us on board to look at establishing a landscape infrastructure framework for the whole region. So rather than just looking at a particular development site, this allows them to see the landscape as a whole and understand where development could then sit kind of safely without risk within that wonderful landscape framework, at the same time as protecting their natural and precious habitats that exist in the area, that create a well-connected green and blue network for the people living there, that help to protect businesses and industry by creating these natural flood barriers. So anyway, I think that is also a great example, and something that isn't happening very frequently in many countries is looking at a landscape at that scale. So I think that's a very interesting example of a landscape framework that can then be used sort of in advance of development and can help to steer development in a way that is integrated within a natural environment rather than kind of being imposed on it.
And is that what you mean by when you write about the landscape-led perspective?
Yeah, exactly. So when I say landscape-led, is exactly that. I mean, looking at the landscape in totality before thinking about development. So currently, the planning process and the whole development process looks at development first with landscape as an afterthought. And now we're starting to see a little bit of change there with the biodiversity net gain policies that are coming into place, with nature recovery networks that are also coming in. But we still need to be doing more, and we need to be thinking about a landscape in its entirety. So the ecosystems that exist there, the watershed that exists, the habitats, the nature corridors that exist in an area. And then that will allow us to then protect those areas that are most vulnerable and sensitive and have the most, I'd say, ecological value, although, all of it does, of course. But it will allow us then to place development in places that will cause the least amount of damage and the least amount of harm, rather than, for example, placing development within a floodplain where we know that it will be flooding in the near future, but we still keep placing developments within floodplains. If we had some sort of landscape structure, we'd also be preventing a lot of serious tragedies. We wouldn't have the kind of flooding that destroys so many properties and businesses, that sort of thing. If we were actually working with the land, that could be prevented.
So for anyone who's feeling just overwhelmed and thinking they're a very small part of a bigger machine, could you give just one tip or one piece of advice maybe, or a way of helping that, people can act on immediately, or just something to help people, I suppose, feel a little bit more empowered about the situation?
I would say the last chapter of my book, I outline a number of things that people can do, but I would say my favorite and what I think is the most important is to eat well. So if you could take away anything from what I say today, it's to eat well, because everything we do in terms of food production and food systems has an immense impact on the land. And so if every individual was thinking carefully about the food they were eating and ensuring that it came from a sustainable farm or a farm that practiced organically and uses organic methods, a farm that isn't using a lot of pesticides and fertilizers and harming the water. So if we're eating things that are grown well and that are brought to market well, then we are making a huge difference in the way that all of the land on the earth is treated. So I would say, yes, eat well, choose carefully the foods that you eat.
Thank you very much to Alexandra for taking part in this interview. And as always, thanks to you for listening. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.